people from outside London are complaining. London is treating the rest of the country very poorly. But in the era of levelling up, we need to start on time.
Yes.
So are we ready to go? Welcome everybody to this event on the new British immigration system. As you can see, we've got an enormously big panel. Normally you invite lots of people and you assume that at least some of them will say they can't make the meeting. Unfortunately, everybody said they could, so we didn't want to turn anybody away. I'm just going to go down the line, one sentence description of everybody. My name's David Goodhart, by the way. I run the Demography unit here at Policy Exchange. Next to me is Madeleine Sumption, who is head of the Migration Observatory in Oxford. Next to Madeleine is Glyn Williams, who is an ex-Home Office official and actually one of the architects of the points-based system that we're going to be talking about. Next to him is Louis von Arn, who is founder of Duolingo, the educational technology company that specialises in language learning and teaching. And Duolingo, by the way, are the sponsors of this event. To the left of Louis is Richard Ekins, who is head of the Judicial Power Review Commission here at Policy Exchange.
Power
Project, sorry. And to the left of Richard is Nick Timothy, who was Chief of Staff for Theresa May and is now, a fellow of Policy Exchange. And next to Nick is Stephen Kinnock, who is MP for Aberavon and Shadow Immigration Spokesman.
Correct.
Phew.
Yeah, well done.
We are, obviously immigration is very much in the news at the moment, particularly the boats, the channel boats. We are going to touch on that, but we want to look at the bigger picture of what has happened since the ending of free movement and the installation of a whole new immigration system. It is very young, it's only been there, it's been there for less than 2 years. The idea behind it was to control low-skill immigration more than had been the case in the era of free movement, and to have a relatively liberal regime for skilled migration. I think it's probably accurate to say now skilled, high-skilled and middling-skilled immigration. There was some dilution of the original intention of making the high skill relatively high, but the salary requirement was negotiated down to 25 grand, and the qualification criterion down to A levels. I think Brian Bell, who's head of the Migration Advisory Committee, said that about 65% of all jobs in the British labour market could now qualify for a work visa. And there are obviously much greater controls on lower skilled immigration, although there are caveats there too, obviously seasonal agricultural work and social care and one or two other areas too. So we got a pretty liberal system. It's new in place. It's less than 2 years old, as I say, and so we're going to discuss how the system has been working. There's also the whole issue of public opinion, public attitudes to this new system. British Future, Sundar Katwala here. So, British Future has produced some work recently suggesting that the ending of free movement, the introduction of greater control itself, reduced anxiety about hostility to large-scale immigration by a substantial margin, like between 10 and 15 points. Other polling evidence suggests that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there does seem to be some evidence that anxiety about immigration declined after the ending of free movement. Obviously, the continuing sort of backdrop of channel boats and arguments about that, and indeed just the sheer numbers that are now coming through the new system might well mean that those numbers will rise again, but that's perhaps one of the things we can talk about. But let me hand over to Madeleine to give us a brief 5-minute overview of how the system is working, and perhaps also, Madeleine, you might say something about what we know about the current numbers, because there's we're in a sort of interregnum. The old quarterly net immigration figures are not coming out every quarter, and we're actually slightly in the dark about what the net immigration figure is.
Yes, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the new immigration system was introduced at a time when, well, firstly, during the pandemic, which caused all sorts of problems, including for immigration statistics. And so we actually don't have as good a picture about exactly what the impacts of the system have been on numbers, for example, that we would have done if it had happened at a more normal time when we had all of the same immigration statistics that we've had. That said, I mean, I think we do have a sort of a reasonably okay picture of sort of the broad brush strokes of what's happened, which is that I mean, it's a very different picture, effectively, for EU and non-EU migration. So EU migration, which it looks like probably made up around half of the growth in the migrant population in England and Wales, as we discovered from yesterday's census figures that came out over the last decade, has dramatically fallen from what we were seeing pre-pandemic. In the last year, very few visas were issued to EU citizens. They were only 5% of the total number of visas. And the Office of National Statistics, in the sort of estimates that it has been able to produce based on sort of a number of assumptions that are uncertain, and so these numbers will probably be revised. But the ONS is estimating that at least in the year ending June 2021, which is the period that we have data for so far, that EU net migration was effectively not contributing to the total, so it was roughly zero. On the other, so that, and if you think about what people said Brexit would do beforehand, many people, including me, said, well, you're going to have a more restrictive system for EU citizens. It's going to bring down the numbers because many people won't qualify, and it does seem to have done that. Now, in normal times, that would probably also have led to a reduction in overall migration levels and net migration levels. These are not normal times, though, and what we've seen at the same time is quite a substantial increase in non-EU immigration and non-EU net migration, which the reasons for which I think are primarily not driven by Brexit itself. There are, so if you look, for example, again, lots of statistical uncertainties, but if you compare the number of visas that were issued in 2019 compared to the last year of data we have, the year ending June this year, you look at, okay, what's driving the growth, which are the categories that have increased most. Then actually the biggest single contributor is the Ukraine and British National and Hong Kong British National Overseas schemes. They account for, I think, more than half of the growth in the number of visas issued. After that, you then have skilled workers, and this includes obviously, this is a system that has been liberalised, but a lot of the growth in that system is jobs that were already eligible under the old system. So we have, particularly nurses. I think that's the largest single category that have driven the increases, and it's a result of very high demand in the NHS and a specific strategy of overseas recruitment in order to increase the number of medical practitioners and nurses in the UK. Then you have students, maybe there's a sort of longer discussion perhaps to be had about students, but we've also seen an increase in the number of students and their family members coming to the UK. So all of those things have basically combined to push up non-EU net migration. I don't think that's 100%. I wouldn't say that is a result of the post-Brexit immigration system. It's happened at the same time. Some of those things will be temporary, but it's really difficult to predict into the future. But we've granted almost 200,000 visas to Ukrainians this year. Presumably, that's not going to happen next year. There's uncertainty about the Hong Kong BNOs and how many of them there will be. We have in the past, surges in recruitment from overseas in the NHS did turn out to be temporary. So there are various reasons that the increases we've seen are not necessarily some kind of new normal. This is what the post-Brexit immigration system is like, but a sort of combination of unique pressures. But then, it's really difficult to project. It could be that we do end up in a system where immigration doesn't fall as much as people expected with the post-Brexit immigration system in the long run, or indeed ends up being higher.
Good, thank you. And thank you for your concision. Glyn. So just a reminder, Glyn is an ex-Home Office official and one of the architects of the points-based system. I mean, I wonder, I know you have some prepared thoughts, but I mean, do you think that we've got the balance right in the system between, as it were, the kind of demands of employers, stroke economy, and the desire to keep net immigration under control?
Well, I was going to sort of end up there because the question is, where do you strike that balance? And I fear that there is no consensus about where that balance should be struck politically. But I was just going to, I just got this exam question, the points-based system, is it working? So if you give me 3 minutes on that. The points-based system, by that I mean the visa system for work and study migration. There's a lot else going on around that, both for economic migration and, of course, illegal migration and asylum. But just focusing on that, if one just scrolls back, 10 years to when Nick, Timothy and I were trying to reduce net migration to tens of thousands, and we had policy stability and political stability in the Home Office, we had basically 2 immigration systems at that time. One was a system for non-EU citizens who had to get a visa under the old points-based system, which was introduced in 2008 by the previous Labour government. And then, of course, alongside that, EU free movement. And the task we were given in 2018-19, when the dust had settled after the referendum and the negotiations with the EU, was to replace that twin dual system with a single global system, which is the phrase that ministers kept using, ending EU free movement and having a single visa system for the whole world for work and study. And of course, alongside that, regularising the immigration status of those EU citizens already in the UK who had rights under the withdrawal agreement, which we did through the EUSS system. Doing all that was actually, if I may say so, a really big delivery and operational challenge as much as a policy challenge. The Home Office was really concerned to get the thing over the line by the time the transition period ended. The basic approach that we took to that new system, it was very much based on the old non-EU system for work and study. That was the starting point. But as you said, David, we recognised that wouldn't do, given the sorts of jobs that EU migrants had been filling on free movement. So that system was modified. For example, the cap on work migration visas, the famous 20,700 cap, was lifted. The minimum skill level was lowered from RQF 6, which is basically graduate level jobs, to RQF 3, which is sort of A-levels, sort of trades jobs. And the minimum salary, which the MAC had recommended to be 30,000, was eventually, it came in at around 24,000. And Boris Johnson, when he became PM, introduced the notion in 2019 of a points-based system, notwithstanding the fact we already had one, but anyway. And so some points were introduced into the system to give some flexibilities, some trade-offs at the sort of lower end, so that salaries could go lower in shortage occupations. So it was made more flexible. And as you said, David, I think it is basically, by comparison with the US system, for example, or even the Australian system, it's pretty open. There's by the way, no resident labour market test anymore. And for students, the post-study work visa was reintroduced, now called the graduate visa, which is a big incentive to Indian students in particular to come. And just on a kind of, does it work? Well, it does, in the sense that a lot of people have been applying for visas and getting them. The latest figures to June 22 were 331,000 work visas and 486,000 study visas, plus all the BNOs, the Ukrainians, etc. Those are actually much bigger figures than pre-Brexit. Obviously, EU citizens are now getting visas as well. But just on a, we had to design a system that worked, and we did. Just saying. But of course, there are things that the points-based system does not do. It doesn't cater for those with no formal qualifications. It doesn't cater for the very low paid. It doesn't cater for casual or seasonal workers. It doesn't cater for the self-employed. Now, actually, we did sort of realise this might be a problem. And if you go back, as I did last night, to the white paper we published in December 2018 on the future immigration system, there was a proposal in that to have a system of temporary visas where people could come for 12 months to do anything, basically, and they couldn't settle after that. They couldn't bring dependents. They'd have to go again. And that was because we were worried that the new system wouldn't be flexible enough. Ministers decided, for perfectly valid reasons to do with abuse and compliance, that they wouldn't take that option up, and we didn't. So we went with what you're now familiar with. Since then, there have been quite a few bells and whistles added to attract the so-called brightest and best, scale-up visas and high potential visas, etc. But we're now in a position where we have labour shortages, so it seems, and part of the response to that, in things like hospitality, agriculture, cleaning, care, construction, there's a very long list, actually, of these sectors, let alone the NHS, as Madeleine mentioned. The government vastly expanded the seasonal agricultural worker scheme. It's gone up to 30,000 a year of seasonal labourers who can come in and work for 6 or 9 months, I've forgotten, in that sector. I think the issue now going forward, the policy issue is, if you're bothered about these labour shortages which are not being addressed by the points-based system, and that's quite a big if, how do you address that? Do you address it by expanding the points-based system to lower the skills level and the salary level further, so that it embraces care, etc.? Or do you introduce lots of sectoral schemes, a bit like the SOARS scheme, and introduce much more of a Gastarbeiter, guest worker culture, where people can come for 12 months, they don't get rights to settle, they don't get rights to bring dependents, but they can go and work in the pub, wherever. And there are sort of technical pros and cons for those two technical answers. But, and I'll finish here, I think you can't decide which of those routes you want to go down until you've got some consensus to what you're trying to do with the system. And the problem is, and I think this has been the case for many years, frankly, but it's kind of on stilts now, is there's no political sense on whether more economic migration is a good thing or not. Clearly, some ministers think it's worrying to have more numbers because it will increase numbers, and you're going to have a situation where the numbers have gone up after Brexit, not down, and that is, I think, difficult for the government in some respects. Is there an economic case for it? Well, of course, economic migration will grow your GDP. It will make businesses otherwise unviable viable because they have access to more labour and basically cheaper labour. But my take on this is we had 20, 25 years of untrammelled free movement, and did that do anything to address the chronic deficiencies in the British economy as regards productivity, skills, investment, training? No. If anything, they've just got worse. And then if you talk to the CBI, they will always say, well, we're in a bad place at the moment, we just need a bit more immigration so that we can steady the ship, employers can get themselves into a better place, and then we'll be okay. They've been saying that for 20 years, I have to say, and it's kind of it's never materialised. So personally, I'm a bit sceptical about the economic case for more migration, but there is a legitimate argument to be made for that. We have a comparative advantage in our flexible labour market, let's add to that. But at that point, we need politicians to be honest about the migration consequences of that, which are going to be much bigger numbers, unless you bring them in as temporary workers and you don't count them. But at the moment, I do feel the Home Office is being asked to do two things at once. One, reduce migration, and two, increase growth through more economic migration. Potentially, that seems to be the discussion that's happening, and I think that's impossible. Thank you.
Thanks. It's kind of one way of perhaps squaring the circle, at least for sectors like hospitality, to extend the youth mobility scheme. And the youth mobility scheme, which is people from 18 to 30, 2 years I think it is, you can't bring in dependents, you can't draw on the welfare state. Well, presumably you can go to A&E if you break your leg, but you can't sort of, you don't have access to the whole system. And we could easily extend that to European countries.
Well, we could extend it unilaterally, but at the moment the youth mobility system is based on bilateral agreements, that it's
Australia,
a two-way
New
thing,
Zealand,
so
Japan,
young Brits can
yeah.
go to Australia and Australians can come here, for example. The EU so far has shown no interest in negotiating that with us, and I'm not sure that ministers themselves want to negotiate with the EU on that. But
Well, why don't we just do it unilaterally? We're doing lots of other things unilaterally post-Brexit, aren't we? Anyway, perhaps we can come back to that. Louis, an international perspective from you. You are one of these brightest and best. You were a model high-skill migrant. You came from Guatemala, went to study in America, and have created a very, very large and successful company, multinational company. Is the UK system, do you think, attractive enough at the moment to people like you? And I know also you want to raise the issue of in order to get a visa to come to the UK, if you're coming from a non-English speaking country, you have to pass a language test, and Duolingo are very interested in making that whole system more efficient, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But give us your overview first.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. Of course, I'm an immigrant, but I am not an immigrant to this country. I immigrated to the United States a while ago, 20 odd years ago. I am one of these people that was highly sought after. Basically a lot of universities wanted me to go there. And the process was, honestly, I almost gave up. It was pretty tough for everywhere to go. And for me, there were multiple reasons. One of them is I grew up in a country where, standardized testing was just not, we don't do standardized testing. That's just not a thing. So I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to having to apply to a university 1 year earlier. I just wasn't used to many of the things. And I had this horrible story that happened. In order to get accepted into a university in the US, I went to the US, I had to take a few standardized tests. One of them was an English test. I took the TOEFL English test. And I had the problem that there were these testing centers and they ran out of spots in my country of Guatemala. So for me to actually be able to immigrate, what I had to do is I had to fly to the neighboring country of El Salvador, which in the late 90s was essentially a war zone. I had to go there to take a test and then come back to my country. The whole thing was like $1,000, and so it was tough. I almost gave up, but thank God I didn't. It was good for me that I didn't. But yeah, I mean, my sense is that the system still hasn't changed, even though that was 20 years ago. The system still hasn't changed, and my sense is probably at the very least should be modernized so that this type of stuff doesn't happen. And particularly for highly skilled labor, now I'm in a position where I run a company where we try to hire very highly skilled labor. I mean, the people that we're looking for are sort of the top of the top, and we have to, one problem we're having in the U.S. is that many of the top are just not wanting to go there anymore, particularly for things, in the previous administration, the Trump administration, there was a lot of rhetoric around like immigrants are no good here, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've had to do is actually open offices. We opened an office in Berlin, we opened an office in Beijing, because that's, we just can't get that talent from those countries to come to the US as much, so we've had to open it there. And that's kind of what's happened to us. So I operate in the in the world of the people who are very highly sought after. My sense is it's pretty hard for them to actually.
Do you have a UK office?
We don't. We have 4 people in the UK. We're thinking of opening a UK office, and there's a lot of good things that would happen here, for us if we open a UK office. So we're thinking about it.
But so you can compare the US with the German system, because you're presumably also then trying to attract people into your German subsidiary.
Yeah. Now what we're doing with Germany is we used it for attracting EU citizens. We're not. We're not taking somebody from Vietnam to try to move them to Germany. So we're doing that.
And with the free movement.
We did the same for in China. The office in Beijing is just so that we could attract Chinese citizens, because we're having a hard time. At least in the U.S., we're having a very hard time. The weird one, which I think is better here than the U.S., which is if you graduate from a top university in the U.S., there's only about a 30% chance that you're going to be able to get a work visa afterwards, which is, I think, absolutely ridiculous. Because these people are educated, they get a PhD from MIT or whatever, and there's a 60% chance they just go back to their country and develop all the artificial intelligence in their country rather than in the US.
Well, and what about our? A lot of people think that our language testing for visas is pretty prehistoric. It's old-fashioned sort of paper exams, and that actually we could do with a bit of sort of Duolingo digital wizardry.
Yeah, I think that's something that we think as a company. We started our own English test, and it's because we're a very mission-driven company. We saw that there are all these people that have to take these tests. The UK is not the only place that requires these English tests. Basically every English country requires those. English-speaking country. They have. You have to go to a testing center. The testing centers are not in every country. So there's a number of countries, 60-ish countries in the world that don't have testing centers. So if you want to immigrate from one of those countries, you got to go somewhere else. And it's because you have to go and take the test with paper. What we did, and this was a few years ago, is we started our own test that you could take online, and so anybody could take it, and at least that makes the process a lot faster. It also not only do you not have to go anywhere, our test you can take it anytime from your home, etc. So we think that that's really helping at least make it easier for the very highly qualified people to go to different places.
And you have ways of making sure that somebody isn't doing the test for you.
Oh yeah. We turn on the front-facing camera of the device, and then we record the whole session, and we have a human actually watch the whole thing. Also, we use AI to facial recognition to make sure that face is the same as the one in the ID. We also use we kind of look at where their pupils are looking, etc. So it's pretty hard to, we actually know, we pay people to try to cheat, and we can catch them, so we know that they're not cheating. And the other thing that makes it very secure on digital, the main way people cheat in the physical testing centers, most of these physical testing centers, by the way, are in developing countries. I am from a developing country, so I'll say this, in my country, most things, if you want to get them done, what you do is you pay somebody to get them done. For example, the way I got my driver's license was to pay somebody, because there was no way to get a driver's license without paying them. That's just how it was. I don't know if I just admitted to a crime, but there was no way to get it. Okay, people, different country. But that is just how people cheat. If you have a physical testing center, you go there and you pay to have your friend take the test instead of you, which is why we think online you can't do that. You can't even talk to the proctor or anything, so you can't do that.
Right. Anyway, from that to boats, etc. Richard, we're not going to, as I said earlier, today is mainly about the new migration system in the UK, but obviously boats are a very big deal. And Richard has been looking at the legal background and what's been going on. So over to you.
Sure, thank you. So it's a bit of a change of subject, and we've been talking about things that may be working well, and now we're talking about something that I think clearly is not working well. It seems to me a bad problem in terms of arrivals by small boat from France and elsewhere, and a problem that only looks set to get worse. And the integrity of our borders certainly seems in doubt, and the UK is seeing arrivals where some subset of persons maybe involved in criminal activity, of course, and obviously some are asylum seekers and some are genuine refugees, but it's an odd basis of priority for determining resettlement, sort of relative ability to move and to pay people smugglers. And the problem is, I think, that we cannot stop boats at sea, cannot stop them safely, and for the time being at least, France will not accept returns. And when people enter the UK by this route, they are, as you expect, rather difficult to remove. It would of course be wrong to return anyone who came in by this method to their country of origin if they were to face persecution there. We shouldn't do that. Those who remain, however, the longer they remain, there's a risk of disappearance or absconding if they were otherwise detained, limited detention capacity of course, and the longer one stays, the greater one's chance of securing a sort of a de facto right of settlement, notwithstanding the illegal nature of one's entry. And every particular removal that is attempted, or not every removal, but a great many of them will be legally contested in ways that make it difficult or impossible sometimes to succeed in removing someone who otherwise has no right to be here. Now I think the problem here is the European Convention on Human Rights and its domestic reception, and not the Refugee Convention. I know some think that the Refugee Convention is the main cause of difficulty here. I don't take that view. I think it does actually contain some significant protections for member states. The government's Rwanda plan is, or I think was, an intelligent idea in principle. The key policy move here, I think, is to make journeys across the channel futile, so that one will not continue to engage the services of the people smugglers in question. The Rwanda plan was discretionary and limited, and I think no reason to think that a handful of removals, even if high profile, would stop tens of thousands continuing to come by this method. And in any case, as will be obvious, the plan is not being implemented. It was halted in its tracks, not by the British courts, but by a single anonymous judge of the European Court of Human Rights in the middle of June, and nothing further has taken place. So what should be done? Well, Policy Exchange published a paper on this in February this year, entitled Plan B, outlining a course of action we thought would respond to the problem, before the Rwanda plan was announced, I should add. And we proposed legislating to make clear that no one who enters by way of small boat from a coastal European state, unless they are fleeing persecution in that state, which is unlikely, would have a right to settle in the United Kingdom. And in fact, legislation should make provision for immediate removal, as in placing a duty on the government to proceed with removal, either to offshore processing in a British overseas territory or to a third country, with a view to settlement safely in a third country, or return to country of origin if the person in question so desires and does not face persecution there. But as we, I think, made pretty clear in our paper in February, this simply won't work without primary legislation to implement it, to mandate it. And that will need to anticipate the lines of judicial challenge that would otherwise bring the scheme crashing to a halt. Importantly, I think legislation like this would need to stipulate that the Human Rights Act does not apply to the legislative scheme. That's not an admission it breaches the European Convention. I think it's arguable it would not. In fact, it's a good argument. But it would mean litigation would not, as I say, prevent the scheme ever coming into force or being able to be operated effectively. And relatedly, one needs to be willing, or the government, if it's going to carry out a plan like this, which remains to be seen, would need to be willing to proceed despite interim measures being ordered by single anonymous judges of the European Court of Human Rights. And if legislation were to require this course of action, then ministers and the Home Office would have to proceed. I think that's the shape of the solution. There are obviously many obstacles in the way of it, and I've got no idea whether it will be adopted at any point, but the current course of action, I think, is doomed to failure.
Thanks. Richard, just perhaps one question. I mean, it's sometimes said that other European countries who are covered by the same both Geneva Convention and European Convention on Human Rights do manage this problem better than we do. Are they doing slightly different things in relation to the law, or I mean?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure how far I can answer. I mean, obviously, a lot of European states are exposed to a major problem here that's causing all sorts of difficulty. Land borders actually have an advantage over maritime borders, surprisingly, because they can be easier to control entry. And so one can deny admission of the border in a way that one can't with the English Channel without causing people to be in jeopardy at sea, which we're not doing and shouldn't do. So ironically, the English Channel is not our friend here, I think, once it becomes obvious that small boats can safely, mostly, cross the channel. Obviously, it's not entirely safe. I think clearly the rates of asylum being granted are quite different in different European countries, continental Europe to the United Kingdom. I don't know exactly why that is, and it would be interesting. Our rates are much, much higher for granting asylum, which must make us a much more attractive location to finally make one's asylum claim. It may be that other European states are not being generous enough with their asylum recognition, although we are being too generous. I'm really not sure about that. But I think if you're safely in France or another state, then it makes perfect sense for France and the United Kingdom to come to an agreement that means that people will not be leaving France, for example, to come here, like the French. Ideally, we'd reach an agreement, that would be plan A, whereby people would be returned immediately so the trip is futile, and then the people wouldn't be leaving and the smugglers would go out of business. Failing that, I think we need some other alternative.
Nick, you've been in the thicket of immigration policy at the heart of government for a few years. Your thoughts, both on the bigger picture and perhaps also briefly on the boats too?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've said at Policy Exchange before that I had a full head of hair before I started working in the Home Office. And that's partly the complexity of the issues and partly the nature of that building and what goes on there. I mean, I think that it's really easy to get lost in the detail of this really quickly, because you're talking about lots of really complex things that interrelate in complex ways. So it's huge bureaucratic processes, international labour markets, operational successes and failures, international treaties, human rights laws, all of these things. But what we're really talking about, I think there's nothing more important on this question. What we're talking about is what kind of country do we want to be? Because immigration changes us socially and culturally, radical diversity undermines social trust, which I think David was one of the first people to really point this out, which affects people's willingness to show the solidarity that some citizenship demands and so on. There is a negative correlation between the levels of immigration we've had over the last quarter of a century with investment in automation and technology. I read something the other day where it asked the question, is Britain becoming the first post-developed economy? Because we're actually going backwards in some of these ways. The most famous example, I think, is the number of automated car wash machines that existed in Britain 20 years ago compared to now. The number's fallen through the floor because they're all done by hand now, because we have this economy that's based on really high levels of low-skilled, low-paid migrant work. And then there's all the consequences about our infrastructures. I mean, more than half of all projected housing demand is caused by migration, and that's not even taking into account the higher birth rates of migrant mothers. So we've got to create hundreds of thousands of new school places in primary schools by the end of the decade. So there are all these really huge things. Now, Glyn and his team in the Home Office, I think, did a brilliant job actually of designing a new immigration system in the time that they had. And that is an achievement. It's not your fault, Glyn, that the policy, in my view, is completely wrong. Points-based systems do what points-based systems do. They increase immigration. They've always been designed, whether you're looking at Australia or anywhere else, to increase the numbers. Yes, you can say that it makes it a bit more selective, but actually the truth about a points-based system is you are sacrificing control, because the principle of a points-based system is if you, a migrant, acquire or show you can acquire the relevant number of points, you basically have a right to come to the country. And I think that's the wrong way around in principle. That we, the country, the government,
But our
acting in the...
I mean, I think that's the Australian system. Our points-based system, it doesn't work like that, though, does it? I mean, you have to have an employer who wants you to come here. You don't have an automatic right just because you have...
Yes, but alongside that, you have rules that have been stripped back so that basically, there's no resident labour market test. The shortage occupation list is extended. Yeah. The salary thresholds have been
reduced,
cut to the floor. When we talk about skilled workers, they include like bricklayers and occupations like that. So it's incredibly easy to do. And Glyn mentioned post-study work for university students. Of course we should want some of the foreign students who come to study here to stay here. The very best ones, the people who are studying the kinds of subjects that we're going to really need in the economy over the coming decades. But more than half of the students who come here are studying at non-Russell Group universities. And we have this system where you have somewhere like the University of Sunderland, where 90-odd% of its students in Sunderland are British nationals, and then they open a campus in East London, where 90-odd% of their students are foreign nationals. So you have all these sort of perversities in the system, and I think at the moment it's just set up for more and more of that. The policy has been deliberate. The points-based system, the accompanying changes, were deliberate attempts to create a super liberal system, which is in contradiction to the Manifesto Pledge in 2019. And Madeleine asked, is this going to become the new normal? I think as a matter of policy, I think it will be unless people are prepared to change it. And I think there are certain the Treasury at the moment, for example, is looking at its fiscal policy and saying, well, we're going to judge our fiscal credibility by saying, is debt going to fall as a share of national wealth? So the easiest thing in the Treasury for the Treasury to do is to say, well, we can increase the size of the economy by simply growing the size of the population. So there are all these reasons why different bits of government just want more and more of it. So I think it's quite clear that there are very good social and economic reasons for why you would want the numbers to be considerably lower than they are now. And that, I think, would require quite fundamental change in terms of rewriting what the system actually is, looking at things like the ECHR in terms of how you enforce the law and make the system work. There probably should be targets to try to drive reductions in the numbers, but actually you've really got to look at this from a sort of whole of government, in a whole of government way, rather than just the Home Office. I mean, ordinarily you have a Home Secretary who wants to control immigration and everyone else trying to increase it. So if you really want to reduce the numbers, you have to do something about skills and training policy. You also have to do something about higher education finance, which actually we should want to do anyway, because higher education isn't really working for half the country. So I think we've got to step right back and try to do this from an all of government perspective.
What about the thing I mentioned at the beginning, the apparent decline in anxiety about immigration, the British Future polling? Do you think that's just a temporary blip, and that as soon as people see the scale of the numbers alongside the boats in the background, that the numbers will just go back to where they've been, sort of 70 plus people saying immigration is too high or much too high?
I've had this conversation with lots of different pollsters, and I've seen some polling that isn't yet published, which I don't want to spike because it's for the report I've written, which shows considerable concern and an understanding that post-Brexit immigration has actually stayed the same or gone up. My interpretation of the changes in public opinion according to that polling is that two things have happened. First, more liberal kind of Remainy kind of voters have become more sort of assertive about their liberalism. So previously they might have said, yeah, I'm happy with how much immigration we have, and now they're saying, I want even more of it, because it's becoming part of their identity. They hate me so much. Yes, that's right. And lots of people who are sceptics about immigration and supported leave were reassured by the end of free movement and thought the numbers were going to come down. That's obviously not happening, and I think those voters are increasingly aware of it. Maybe not all of them are yet, but basically we're in a process of them realising it.
Stephen, your leader, Keir Starmer, did, I think he had one line about immigration in his conference speech, which is basically saying he also supported a points-based system. I wonder if you can perhaps tell us a little bit more about whether you're happy with the system as it is, or whether you would have a very different kind of points-based system. And also, I might just ask a perhaps slightly cheeky question. I mean, do you not actually see an opportunity to completely and utterly nail down the next election by actually outflanking the Conservatives on immigration and having a more restrictive policy than the relatively open and liberal one that we've been hearing about?
Thanks, David. Some great questions there. I hope to be able to address them. I'm not going to be able to write Labour's manifesto right here and now, much as I'm sure Policy Exchange would love me to do that. But I thought I'd just maybe start by saying what it is that we want to achieve across the entirety of our economic policy, and that our immigration policy has to be a subset of that. And we want a high-wage, high-productivity economy, which is driving growth in a sustainable way. I think most people recognise that there's been for a very long time now a productivity crisis in the UK, and that's one of the main reasons that we've had anemic growth. There's a whole range of reasons around why we have such low productivity, not least the way in which the trade unions have been smashed since the 1980s. But that's, of course, a topic for another day. I think that immigration does play a role and has played a role in undermining productivity for many of the reasons that Nick and others have set out, because you can end up using it as a crutch to deploy relatively low-wage labour instead of investing in technology and plant and machinery, etc. So I think there's a high degree of consensus on this panel that if the driver is about the right kind of economic growth and addressing the productivity crisis, we need to see it in this context. Labour is absolutely clear, as Keir did say in his speech, that we do not support a return to free movement of labour. We do support a points-based immigration system, but our view is that the one that is currently in place now, the way in which it's sort of been interpreted and put in place since 2019, particularly since Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, if anyone can remember how long ago that was, few things have changed since then, that is not fit for purpose. And it's not fit for purpose for a number of reasons. It's not balancing this need to train up and recruit our local homegrown talent against the need to recognise that in some sectors, for the reasons that we've just discussed, we might not like it, but it's a reality that some sectors have become reliant on, they became reliant on free movement, they become reliant on certain types of immigrant labour, and if you turn the tap off for those sectors, those industries may well fall over. So it's a balancing act. I suppose it's about this tension between strategy and tactics. If your strategy is what I started out by talking about, how do you make sure your tactics support your strategy and you don't cut off your nose to spite your face? As has been recognised, in 2021, there were 239,987 work-related visas granted. That was 25% higher than in the last full year. And the number of professions, as Nick was saying, that qualify for skilled visas has expanded significantly. Now includes chef, bricklayer, electrician, welder, healthcare worker, whilst the government has removed caps on most visa routes. You set that against the fact that in some of the sectors that were reliant on, for example, seasonal workers, we've got 500,000 vacancies in the farming and food sector, and we had to cull 35,000 pigs. It doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense that we're doing that. There's also lots of jobs lost in the construction sector, and projects are slowing, and that's vital in terms of pushing forward growth as well. So what Labour wants to do is look at some of the weaknesses in the system. We feel that there's too much of a gap, and I'm sure Madeleine might want to comment in this. There's too much of a disconnect between the Skills and Productivity Board and the MAC. We'd like to have a much better conversation between those two, particularly around producing the shortage occupation list. So the decisions around shortage occupation lists are driven by issues around skills and productivity. And we've got another, what hasn't really come up much on the board so far, on the panel so far, is we're worried about increasing cases of undercutting and exploitation. Unscrupulous employers, and particularly recruitment agencies, are not doing enough to be sure that exploitation isn't happening. We're seeing increases in bonded labour. Part of this is, of course, because we're now getting more and more of workers coming from outside the European Union. In fact, much of the relationship with, for example, recruitment agencies operating in the European Union was more regulated than we're seeing from countries like Indonesia and Nepal and others. So there's a real issue there, I think a bit of a ticking time bomb around increased exploitation. So we want to review the decision around scrapping the resident labour market test. I personally have major question marks about whether that was the right thing to do. Again, I can't write our manifesto here. We certainly want to review and look at that very hard. We want, as I said, the Migration Advisory Committee and the Productivity and Skills Board to work in tandem. We want to end the undercutting of wages and conditions and put that together with a broader strategy around workforce planning. So our thinking around this would be to have a proper conversation happening between government and trades unions and industry and employers around a workforce plan, which states very clearly that over, for example, a 3-year period, this is what we're going to do to train and recruit and develop skills and invest in the skills of our people and of our homegrown talent. In return for that, you have a conversation about what you may need in terms of labour coming from outside the country to ensure that as you ramp up on the former, you can ramp down on the latter, because the overall objective is to make, buy and sell more in Britain, to have our economy really firing, to have that productivity, to get the skills and the recruitment and the development that we need to see. So that would be the first thing, is a if you like, a 3-way conversation, sector by sector, to get that planning in place. And the leverage, of course, you have is that if you want to be a sponsor employer, this is what you need to do in order to get your license. I think for too long, the government hasn't had that quid pro quo with employers, where it said, well, what's your plan to develop your workforce in the long run, rather than just using immigration as a crutch. Let's actually look at how you balance the two and get a proper strategy in place that ensures that we get the growth that we need, that we get industries not turning the tap off and completely destroying that industry because they need that labour, but at the same time showing us what their long-term plan is. And a final point on that, just on the undercutting issue, we would want to see employers signing up to a good jobs charter, which would have a range of terms and conditions that would be needed in order to be able, again, to get the licence to be able to bring workers in from outside the country.
So you are proposing something more restrictive than the current system. I think you have just won the next election.
You heard it here first.
But no, it's often occurred to me too that we should link the occupations on the shortage occupation list with the training system, which we clearly don't do at the moment. I mean, we have a very decentralised training system, so it's not sort of simple. You can't just sort of say, well, but we do have boot camps. You can incentivise people to take courses at FE colleges and so on. So there are, I don't know whether, I should have mentioned that you're also a Migration Advisory Committee person, Madeleine. I mean, do you think that we could do more in that keep a much closer eye on the shortage occupation list and do something about it?
Yeah, I think there's an extent to which, I mean, I think there's a good case that the UK needs more of a sort of workforce strategy. You know, there are lots of issues at the moment, including, you know, inactivity among older people, for example, who've withdrawn from the labour force. I think there has been more, for a long time it was definitely the case that that there was sort of no connection between the shortage occupation list and educational or sort of training strategies, as far as I know at least. There has been some more coordination recently. I think there is one thing that I sort of caution, I guess, that I would mention is that the shortage occupation list on the immigration side, I mean, I think the analysis that is done, very useful to coordinate, to think about where the gaps are and how the workforce strategy or kind of educational training might change to do that. It's very difficult on the immigration side to come up with this list of okay, well, we need sort of 1,000 plumbers and we need 2,000 teachers, and that, I think there's often there's a lot of in the policy debate. My sort of heart often slightly sinks when sort of you get this recommendation. It's like, well, the shortage occupation list can fix all of your problems. We'll just work out who the people are that we need, and we'll bring in those people, and we won't bring in these people. But the whole thing is actually it's a very difficult, uncertain exercise. The data are never quite good enough to work out the answer. The judgments are quite subjective. So I think sort of my one note of scepticism would be sort of avoid. Generally, I think it's a useful idea to avoid policy recommendations that rely on the idea that the shortage occupation list is the final truth on where the shortages are, because there is a huge amount of uncertainty.
But there have been a lot of stories in the newspaper recently about us having us needing 80,000, I think it is, fibre optic engineers for the broadband rollout. We've been rolling out broadband for the last 15 years, for goodness sake. I mean, why is it that we suddenly need 80,000 fibre optic engineers? Although actually somebody said to me, what that really means is we need 80,000 people to dig the ditches that the cable's going. So,
I have a general policy of ignoring any statement of we need X thousand people to do this thing. I think tends to be nonsense, unless there are specific cases like doctors and nurses and care workers where you've got a sort of set amount of stuff that needs to be done, when maybe they're justified. But otherwise, I think they're mostly made up numbers.
Good. Now we have got. I think we're here till 7:15, aren't we? So we've got a bit of time for questions, both from the audience here, the very distinguished audience here. I know most of your names, and also questions from our online viewers, listeners, viewers, whatever you're doing. So, and also do feel, I mean, perhaps actually, if any of you have kind of burning questions you want to ask somebody else on the panel, well, you can do that perhaps in the course of the Q&A session. So, who do I see? Al, do we have? We do. We have a roving mic.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you the stellar
Can
panel
you say who
that
you
you've
are?
got.
Can you say who you
Sorry,
are?
my apologies.
I know who you are,
You said Alp, and
yeah.
I'm Alp Mehmet, Migration Watch. I agree and disagree with everyone there. Firstly, may I just say that the concerns about immigration, and Sundar will argue, I know, but are there, and in fact are increasing. Secondly, the system is working because it's doing, as Glyn said, what it was designed to do. It's increasing immigration. I'm surprised that no one on the panel, apart from Nick, suggested that actually high numbers do matter, and that any system should address that. 240,000 is on the low side. We don't really know. A government minister suggested that 300,000 net migration this year is more likely to be the case. 240,000 was 6 times what it was when Tony Blair took over in number 10. So of course it matters. When we have immigration at this sort of level, we've got to reduce it, and the system must take account of that. That is my point. How would they do it?
Let's take 2 or 3 now. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Sahil Shah, co-founder Tipping Frontier. We model the impact of climate change on migration. And in the run-up to COP27, I'm curious, taking a slightly longer-term lens, whether there should be a joined-up approach between the Home Office and FCDO when it comes to climate adaptation and climate finance to manage the root causes of migration into the UK.
Tony there, and then the gentleman at the back, and then tell us who you are, Tony. I know who you are, but I don't think other people do.
Hello, Tony Smith, former head of the UK Border Force, now an immigration commentator. One for Glyn and one for Richard. Glyn, are we ever going to return to enforcement of EU and EEA nationals? Because we haven't really done any enforcement. In fact, they're still allowed through e-gates. There aren't any enforcement operations in place. Enforcement teams are being told to leave them alone, really, because we're really worried of another Windrush, an EU Windrush. And so we need a very, very gentle light touch on. So actually, I don't think there's very much of a heart to do enforcement. So you're not really equalising EEA from non-EEA, I don't think, because there isn't any. Do you see any direction, policy direction, where we might actually take back control of EU and actually non-visa nationals who may be overstaying, working illegally? And Richard, Albanians. So the boats have changed. Since we wrote our report, the cohorts have changed. Albanians are removable. We have a readmission agreement with Albania. What is the legal impediment to removing Albanians quickly to Albania?
And gentleman at the back. And then people can
Thank you. Michael Howard, member of the House of Lords and Home Secretary at the time that Tony Blair became Prime Minister, when the figures were as suggested by one of your previous questioners. I have two questions for Richard Ekins. First of all, wouldn't his scheme, as put out in February, fall foul of the ECHR, so that even if the Human Rights Act were excluded, complainants could go directly to the Court of Human Rights, and wouldn't that scupper the scheme? Secondly, he said that the ideal solution would be an agreement with France, under which France would take people back. There is such an agreement in force. It was reached in 1995. It originally even covered asylum seekers, although it was superseded in that respect by the Dublin Convention, which didn't work as it was intended to work. But it is still in force, and it would still enable the UK government to return to France those who are not claiming asylum. And I don't know if anyone on the panel can explain why the UK government isn't taking action under that agreement.
Okay, let's have some answers, panel. Do you have a...
Just on that point, I think that was the agreement which is referred to as the gentleman's agreement for some obscure reason.
Well, Michael's a gentleman.
The trouble is, as you said, it excluded asylum, and basically everybody, well, it does now though, because it was superseded by the Dublin Agreement. Yeah, but we're in the present day, so it was superseded by the Dublin Agreement, and the French will not. Well, everybody who comes in sport boats claims asylum, 100%. Well, some of the Albanians are claiming to be victims of trafficking, but the Iranians, the Iraqis, the Eritreans, the Sudanese, the Afghans, the Syrians, they're claiming asylum. Well, you're shaking your head. Have you
Well,
got
we've
another?
heard in recent days that many Albanians do not claim asylum.
What, so Albanians, I think, are different, but they are claiming to be victims of trafficking.
Modern slavery.
And they then fall into the national referral mechanism, and that's a whole different story. And I agree that needs to be looked at. But the French, you can't force the French, even if we had a legal agreement with the French, which we don't, you can't force the French to do anything. They've got their own domestic political concerns, and they also see this in the context of the whole UK-EU relationship. And frankly, until we've sorted out the Northern Ireland Protocol and all the fracas in that relationship, we're not going to get the French to do very difficult things like take back migrants. who they think are basically our problem in the first place.
Louise, what about the climate change issue? I mean, is Guatemala going to be very adversely affected by climate change? Are there going to be big population movements, do you think?
Major.
From parts of Latin America and Central America?
I think so. I mean, most of it is probably going to go to the US, but this is a major concern, yeah.
Mm. Any answers for specific questions?
Well, there are a few to me, so maybe I should have a go. So Tony's question about Albania, I can't speak in particular to why Albanians are not being removed. I suspect, so there's speculation, that it's simply part of the fact that it's difficult to remove anyone, as in it's costly, resource intensive, and subject to multiple legal challenges. And I suspect, I mean, it's been touched on already, modern slavery is having a particular bite there, and that's causing delay, and there's only so much resource, hence people are not being removed. Maybe they will in due course, but the time matters clearly, as does the editorial comment. You know, if they're not removed immediately, and then of course the risk of just disappearing, and then you're no longer in the system, so you don't get removed. So as to Lord Howard's questions, I mean, I wasn't aware of the agreement in question, but I suspect that unfortunately we don't have a workable agreement now. I can see why the French don't want to conclude one. I mean, the French obviously are doing a lot of work and stopping a lot of boats leaving, and that's significant. The problem could be a lot worse without their cooperation as far as it goes. I think they've got, I mean, there's I think a strong moral case for an agreement, namely that both countries are committed to opposing people smuggling networks and saving people's lives in the Channel, and if one did have an agreement for immediate return, turn the boats back round, then one destroys the business model immediately. Unfortunately, I don't see much chance of that happening anytime soon, which is why we've been thinking about a plan B. If one excludes application of the Human Rights Act, you turn to the legal position effectively for this subset of policy, the legal position that prevailed until the Human Rights Act came into force in October 2000. And by which it's very true, you're quite right, people could proceed directly to Strasbourg. Now, of course, we've seen pretty rapid proceeding to Strasbourg anyway, litigation ongoing in the UK, and yet when interim relief not granted by all of our courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, an application again to a single anonymous judge succeeding in putting a spanner in the works. So I think really we're going to need legislation that mandates particular actions on the part of the Secretary of State and the Home Office, so that we shift the default. Because at that point, if the law requires certain actions to take place, because Parliament judges the government's proposals sensible and worth implementing, then by all means we could face hostile action from the Strasbourg court telling us to stop. But if the law requires us to proceed, well, then that's a very different proposition to discretion where ministers fold straight away. And now I've said this in print. I think the interim jurisdiction that the Strasbourg court is asserting is made up. I mean, it literally is made up. You can see where they did it. We're committed to honouring final judgments against us, not honouring assertions made in the course of a bogus interim jurisdiction. By all means, it's going to be a big fight later on about the compatibility of such a scheme with the European Convention, and we can argue that in the Strasbourg court and reserve our position until later. But at the moment, we're not getting going.
Why don't we just claim derogations from the relevant parts of the convention, set up our own refugee and asylum convention, a British one?
Well, that's a different. You're mixing conventions here, I think. So, with the European Convention on Human Rights, we can derogate from certain articles, but not many of the ones that are being called in aid here. So, derogation is an important tool, important protection, but a limited one. And as I said, I don't think the Refugee Convention is the problem here. I think I mean, sometimes it's gold-plated, it's over-read, but the protections it provides for states are sensible, and we should stand on them. And the European Court has partly extended European human rights law to elaborate or undercut really the protections the Refugee Convention provides to states, to create a new European law of immigration and asylum that goes beyond what the member states agreed.
Stephen, you wanted to jump in on...
Yeah, thanks very much. Just on a couple of things, really. Just on Alp's point about overall numbers, I just worry about the sort of arbitrary nature of setting targets in terms of numbers. I think the tens of thousands target ended up being a very damaging thing to do because it was a very blunt instrument. And what I'd like to see is a much more nuanced approach based on workforce planning, based on a proper productivity and skills plan, based on making employers show how they are going to maximise opportunities for homegrown talent, which should lead to a ramping down of their reliance on bringing labour in from overseas. And I think that's getting the balance right between getting the overall strategic change that we need without crashing the economy in the process. On the issue of the small boats, I mean, I think what we haven't really said much about here, and I know that Richard's been focusing on the European Convention and some of the other sort of legal aspects of all of this, but there's a fundamental thing around here, which is that £7 million of British taxpayers' money is being wasted every day on hotels. And we've got to find a way of repurposing that money into the Home Office so that you've got caseworkers and decision makers who are making those decisions and moving people through the system rapidly. That, of course, has to be combined with getting that better deal with France. I mean, questioning whether President Macron is a friend or a foe, deeply unhelpful, using incendiary language, which the Home Secretary did in the Chamber the other day. We also see the impact of that on trying to have a grown-up and constructive dialogue with other governments, such as the government of Albania. So all of that has to happen, but I think if we had a system that was working more efficiently and effectively, if you're thinking of spending $10,000 with a people smuggler getting on a boat, and you know that you're within 2 to 3 months that is going to be turned around and you may well be getting sent back, that's going to be the key disincentive that breaks the model of the people smugglers. On the question very briefly of Albanians, I'm just very reluctant at the moment to make much more comment on that without really knowing the data. The Albanians that are coming, how many are men, how many are women? How many of these are, both women and men, are making claims under modern slavery? What is happening to them when they claim under modern slavery? Are they just literally directly melting into the underground economy? If that is the case, where in the underground economy are they going? My understanding is there's a high demand for Albanians who work in the building and construction sector. Is there an opportunity for us there to talk to the building and construction sector and find out whether that's happening? But without really knowing the data on who these people are and where they're going and how it is they seem to be melting away into the system, I think we should just be very careful about the comments that we make without knowing all the facts and the data.
I mean, you talked about breaking the model, the people trafficker model. I mean, doesn't processing people in Rwanda do that?
Well, the Rwandan government says it can accommodate a maximum of, I've seen different figures, between 300 to 500 asylum seekers who claim asylum in Britain. Now, we're almost at 40,000 this year. So if I were thinking of paying a people smuggler $10,000, I'd look at the odds. What are my odds of getting to Britain and being sent to Rwanda, knowing that the Rwanda government is on the record as saying we can only take 300 to 500? They're pretty good odds. I think it's utterly unworkable. It is chasing headlines. It is unaffordable. That the government so far has spent £140 million on a press release, as far as I can see. And my view is it's unethical. It is not right for us to unload our problems and dysfunctions on a developing country thousands of miles away, which itself has a very dubious record in human rights.
Glyn, you were involved in some of the early stages of it. What?
Well, look, I didn't pretend to, and I worked for 3 years on small boats from when it started in Christmas 2018, and Sajid Javid came back from his holiday in South Africa, and we worked intensively with the French, and it's just got worse and worse, despite everybody's best efforts. The real problem with small boats is that criminals are making money out of it, quite easy money. Previous illegal immigration was very much spontaneous in the sense that individual migrants were jumping into lorries, and concealing themselves. This is organised crime, and the organised criminals are making money, and therefore they're not going to stop just because we do some fancy Dan policy initiative. It's going to have to be tackled either through law enforcement and or through breaking the business model economically. But that's difficult. The other thing about small boats I'd just say is that if you look at the asylum grant rates of the nationalities coming in small boats, they're like in the 90%. They're claiming asylum and they're getting asylum. So, you know, I just put that out there. Is that a good thing? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is the system working or not working? If you don't like those outcomes, you need to do something to change the parameters of asylum policy, which kind of brings you back to the international framework, I think, as much as anything. But these are very tricky issues. Can I just say something on workforce planning?
Quick. Yep.
So, I do agree actually with both Stephen and Nick about the need for more workforce planning. But you know, in the Home Office, and Nick remember this, we talked to the Department of Health about the NHS workforce plan, and they had a great plan. They were going to be self-sufficient. You know, hardly any immigration round about now, and look where that has got to. I mean, they're more dependent than ever on immigration, and it's very, very frightening to me that this country can't even train sufficient doctors and nurses, let alone unskilled jobs. But so why has that gone wrong? Well, probably pay and conditions. So you can't divorce the immigration debate from, you know, these wider issues.
Well, it's not that there's a cap on, we train 7,500 doctors a year rather than, you know, the 15,000 or so that we could, given the people who are with the potential qualifications. But, anyway, you wanted a perhaps final word, Nick, and actually can I, before you make your final comment, can I, as somebody who is in the Home Office trying to reach this tens of thousands net immigration target, it always occurred to me that this was a somewhat wrong-headed target, and that the real target, you know, in relation to what you were just talking about, rapid demographic change, the real thing that people worry about is society changing too fast, and that in which case it's not the kind of flows of immigration that we should be worrying about so much. We should be encouraging more and more immigration to be temporary, and that what we should be targeting is permanent residence. You know, we should have and if we had a target of 100,000 permanent residents a year, you'd have reached that target comfortably. It's currently about 100,000, the number of people who are granted permanent residence here. Why have we never targeted that, rather than the sort of vagaries of the comings and goings of net immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually quite a difficult debate, because I think, I mean, if you end up in a situation where you have huge numbers of people living temporarily, then you're still not addressing some of the problems that we're talking about anyway, like you know, demand for housing, if they bring dependents, demand for schooling, etc. I think there is a point about settlement, but I think you have to try to balance the two different things, because the people who actually are coming on a medium to long term basis, who then do put down roots, you don't want to, I think.
What if they know they're only coming temporarily, like the youth mobility scheme? I mean, it's a sort of classic.
Sure, but I mean, lots of people come to a country and then life changes. They meet somebody, etc. And I don't think you want to put lots of obstacles in the way of settlement for people who have built a life here. But I just wanted to say something about Michael's point, because as ever, I think you got to the heart of it. The ECHR is connected to so many issues in the immigration system, whether it's about the crossings, whether it's about the deportation of foreign criminals, failed asylum seekers, or whatever. And I personally think that there is a case to be made for leaving the ECHR, for incorporating its articles into our own legislation and allowing Parliament to decide where the balance between the rights lies. But I think ultimately it is a kind of binary choice in this debate, and the arguments that you can somehow remove some of the impediments that are imposed by the ECHR via domestic legislation, I think would turn out to be wrong when tested, because ultimately people will petition the court, there will be more injunctions stopping the state from doing things, and so on. There might be some things you can do now in the margins where Parliament could say, consistent with the ECHR, this is our interpretation of, for example, the balance between the right to a family life and society's right to public safety, etc. We could say the same about plenty of other rights in the Convention where Parliament could be specific, and that might help in some cases. But ultimately, the challenge is the ECHR, which has become a kind of quasi-constitutional law, and the kind of halfway house solutions that are sometimes promoted, I think will get us absolutely nowhere.
Good. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw things to a close. Thank you very much for everybody's very absorbing comments. Thankfully, nobody actually fell off the stage. And thank you, audience, for your attentive listening and your questions. So can we just thank you.